were given the opportunity to ask a question, any question, and you knew that it would be answered, what would you ask? What's the question you've always wanted to know the answer to, but just haven't had the time or the opportunity to ask anyone yet? Even better, what's the question that keeps you up late at night? The question that you know a search engine won't be able to answer because your question is fundamentally ungoogleable and requires a human's response. Perhaps it's a question you feel ashamed to ask, something you feel like you should already know. And because no one else around you is asking this question, you yourself will never ask it, for fear that if you do, the people around you will realize just how little you know about the world. As a teacher, I get asked lots of questions. But after attending a professional development session in my first year of teaching, I started to worry about the questions my students weren't asking me. In a session unpacking the minds of 14-year-olds, I was sitting with a group of friends and we started talking about all of the things that we wanted to know at 14 that we'd never asked anyone. Or more accurately, things that we'd never asked anyone who was responsible enough to give us a decent answer. The presenter highlighted the fact that in the age of TikToks, Insta stories, and unfiltered content on the internet, most young people turn to Google and other search engines to ask the types of questions they feel like they couldn't or shouldn't ask anyone else. The kinds of questions that are too awkward to ask a parent. Questions that might reveal a gaping hole in their knowledge, inviting ridicule from friends or stern looks from teachers. But there are some questions that can't be answered by a search engine, and there are some questions that, once they're asked, need to be followed up in ways that a search engine simply can't. Walking out of that session, the presenter's slide of real questions asked by real teenagers was the only thing on my mind. So many questions about sex and drugs and alcohol and relationships. In that moment, I was terrified. I was 22, finally living my dream of teaching, and the realization that my students could walk silently out of my classes with questions that desperately needed to be answered challenged me on every level. I felt completely unprepared to answer their questions, but I knew I had to do something. The next day, after some significant mental preparation, I gave 25 Year 10 students a sticky note and the opportunity to ask a question. As I passed each student a sticky note, I said, "This is the time for you to ask a question that you would like an answer to. It might be a question about something we're studying in class, or about school, or it might be a question about life, the universe, or anything in it." The first time I said this to my students, they looked at me with wide, curious eyes. "Any question?" they probed. "You'll answer any question?" And I could see the cogs start to whir in their minds. What kind of question wouldn't Ms. Rowlston answer? What will happen if I ask that question? Oh, she's looking at me. What question should I write on the small yellow sticky note in front of me? As the students began to ponder which question they would ask, I added, "And every question asked by the people in this class will get a response that will be shared with the people in this class. If I don't know the answer to your question, I'll find someone who does and share their thoughts with you." Then, with a smile, I finished, "And every question you ask will get a response. There's no limit to the kinds of questions you can ask, but if you ask a question that's too personal, the response you get might be, 'Ms. Rowlston's not answering that.'" The questions I got back from my students astounded me. Some of them wanted to know more about me, my hobbies, my favorite book, and whether I make my own clothes. The answers to these questions were easy. I like to crochet. My favorite book changes, but at the moment it's Circe by Madeline Miller. And yes, I even made this dress. Then I got questions that were more difficult. How do you do your tax? When is a good time to start investing? How do you live a good life? These were not the questions about sex and drugs that I had mentally prepared for. They were even harder. How, as a 22-year-old, was I even going to begin? I mean, I use an accountant for my tax. I personally don't own any shares, and in regards to figuring out what a good life is, I'm still working on it. So I turned, as most young people do, to our friend Google. With a quick Google search, I found the website for the Australian Taxation Office and a beginner's guide to starting investing. That left living a good life. To answer that question, I turned to the brilliant people I work with, who freely gave up their time to share their insights into life, the universe, and what it means to be a good human. I shared the answers I found in a virtual classroom with my students, and as the year progressed, I began doing sticky note questions with all of my classes. The virtual classrooms we created together became a record of the things that we were discussing and the events that were shaping my students' lives. At the end of the year, I asked all of my students in all of my classes, what's the most important thing you learned this year? Every student said the thing that they had learned that was most important, the thing that they would carry forward into next year and the rest of their lives, were the answers to our sticky note questions. Fast forward to 2020, and each week I am handed hundreds of questions on sticky notes. I'd like to say that in my 3 years of teaching, I've become significantly wiser and can now answer all of these questions by myself, but that would be a lie. I'd estimate that I, along with my trusty assistant Google, answer about 70% of the questions students ask. To answer the rest, I rely on a wonderful team of educators who openly are happy to share their lives, experiences, successes, and failures with my students. Online learning posed a unique challenge to the way I do sticky note questions. Unlike 2019, when I invited different teachers into my classes to answer student questions live, 2020 has seen the introduction of an adulting podcast, where each week students submit questions via a Google Doc and I randomly select 3 for a guest to answer. At the end of the week, I share the audio with my classes for them to listen to and ponder over the weekend. So, after answering all of these questions, what have I learned? Well, first of all, students are way more concerned with taxation than I thought. The first round of sticky note questions with a new class will inevitably bring me at least 5 variations of the question, how do I do my taxes? I've learned that most of the questions young people ask don't have one answer. But if students are part of an environment where they are empowered to ask difficult questions, they will inevitably become part of the research team that offers new, unique, challenging, and multiplicitous answers. I've also learned just how many young people are concerned with their futures. How many young people are worried about disappointing the important figures in their lives? And how many young people are grappling with the concept of what it means to be a decent, functional, and responsible human? Humans who are kind, caring, and considerate. Humans who have clear goals and strategies for success, but who also recognize failure as an opportunity for growth. Humans who advocate for change and make the world a better place through their actions, and perhaps most importantly of all, humans who aren't afraid to ask the awkward, difficult, complex, and challenging questions that young people are all too often so hesitant to ask. I couldn't finish this without sharing some of the questions that I was asked this week. So here they are. What is one small thing you can do every day to make yourself happy? Sometimes with all the constant news and media updates going on, it can become a little overwhelming. What is your number one tip for keeping things in perspective? How do you feel about suspenders? If you have the opportunity, or you have the power to create the opportunity to ask a young person what questions they have, do it. There are few things as powerful as finding out exactly what issues a young person is grappling with and then being part of the research team that helps provide them with answers. It takes time to create an environment where young people feel comfortable enough to ask these kinds of questions. It's tough, and it requires an investment from teachers, from adults, and from the students themselves. And I can't promise that if you try out sticky note questions, that you won't get questions about sex or drugs or alcohol or relationships. I can, however, promise that you will get difficult questions. Questions that are awkward, uncomfortable, and hard to answer. But aren't those the kinds of questions that need to be answered the most?